part two is going to build on this, but in this case, we're going to animate now. And the first thing that we need to do is, let's come back over. We're going to reutilize the mints, but I'm going to close this off now. And I'm going to turn back on the Opera component and then the labels. And you can see those show up in the render right there. What I want to do is I want to come over here and let's do a little bit of scene editing. I'm going to come back into the front view and we're going to note that the objects, as I've started it, I modeled this and I set this up at exactly 0 on each axis in the world origin. That's really important when you're doing instances of collections. Here's the cursor. I'm going to press Shift and S and I'm going to return the cursor to the world origin. Now I'm going to come back up here to the mint container, the master mint container collection, and I'm going to do an instance to the scene. And that's going to create an exact duplicate exactly where it is. But the cursor needed to be at the world origin for that to happen. So let's come up here and I'm going to move that about right there. We can change, you can see the empty that it's attached to is pretty huge. So I'm going to come over here and take that down a little bit smaller in size. And I'm just going to do a quick bit of posing right here. Something like that. And then we can come up and do a quick preview. And you can play with whether you like this, your artistic handiwork right there. Okay, so that was easy. The important thing to understand is that if we come here to this sub collection that has these components, one of them is the one that we want to again be enabled to catch the particles. But if you have an object inside of a collection and you do an instance of the collection, it won't function inside of a simulation. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come over here and I'm going to do a select hierarchy on these two components which I put inside of their own empty. And I'm going to reference these to the main scene. But we're not going to do it via a collection right here. So what I want to do is I want to create a duplicate, a linked duplicate specifically, of these objects in the scene that I can move off to the side, have them linked to that original, but still give me some independent control of their position and the fact that I want to animate with those. So what I'm going to do is just come back to the object menu here and we're going to invoke the duplicate linked function again. Now it's going to initially try and move them. Press the escape key and that'll reset them to the original position, but now we have a duplicate over here. And what we want to do is I want to move these. See, if I come over here and try and move those, we've already got an instance of the original in the scene. It's going to give us another instance and I don't want that to happen. Okay, so what we need to do is take these and move them into the main scene collection. But there's going to be a problem here. Since these are selected, you would think, well, why don't I just move them up? Just move them to the main scene collection. And you can do that, but something might happen. It may be that if you move them, it'll leave the originals here and it will create grayed out versions in the main scene. You might see that happen, and if that happens, just undo and simply come back in here and do a select hierarchy a second time on it. For some reason, that seems to reset the command to move these to a different collection. So that's what we want to happen right there. Now what we want to do is move these into position. See, now I can come over here and I can move that without it affecting this collection instance. So what I want to do is I want to rotate this, just sort of pose it into the screen the way I like it. And I think that works. I think I can do a quick test render and that works pretty well for what it is that I want. Okay, so now we're ready to go in and drop some of our mints into that for animation purposes. So the first thing that we want to do is let's just come over here to the metal part and let's re-enable the physics system for that. So we're going to come down here to physics properties, rigid body. We're going to set this to mesh and then passive. Okay, we need to make sure to set this to 0.01 and that's all we need to do. We're not messing with any other settings. So let's come in now and create a mint that we can use to populate this. So we're going to come back to our original mint collection right here, and I want to duplicate that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to bring up the context menu, and I'm going to copy that. And here in the main scene collection, which is where I want it to go, context menu again, and we're going to paste new data block, and there it sits down there at the bottom. Now I really want it kind of from an organizational standpoint, I want it to be inside of this container. And I'd really like it to be just not free floating inside there. So what I'm going to do temporarily is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to remove the rotation. And I'm going to copy this because I've got a perfectly usable empty right here in the position that I want, that I can use as an organizational structure for our new set of mints that we're about to use. So I'm going to copy this. Now we just come up and we press paste, and it puts it at the same level. It doesn't put it inside of that. So I'm going to call this dropped mints. Grab it, begin moving it, and then hold the shift key down, and then you can drop it inside of this container underscore lower empty. Okay, so now I'm going to take this single mint right here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to come over here, hold the shift key, and I'm going to drop that into place. So I'm going to press the N key. It's still sitting over there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to move that right there. In fact, let's look at this in the top view. I'd like to sort of put that back into that rotation position that I had done before. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to rotate that just into that post position that I sort of liked. I didn't strictly need to remove that rotation, but you know, the workflow is what it is when you do it. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to move this up. Let's come into the sort of a front view or along the y-axis. Let's move that up just a little bit. But what I want to do is I want to move it up so it's just outside of the camera frame. So it's going to be sitting a ways up there. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to come over here and enable rigid body for that, because it's going to fall. Since it's the first one, we might as well just go ahead and turn it on. So active is correct, convex hull is correct. Settings, we want to change the weight or the mass because it's 2.2 pounds for a mint. It's way too big. Let's set this to 1 gram. That's more appropriate. And we really don't need to change much else. It's very simple. Okay, but now we need to populate our scene with the series more of them. So we're going to again use that object duplicate linked function, and I'm going to do it just along the z-axis. I'm going to press Z about like that, Shift R a bunch of times to create sort of a first column, if you will. So these are all duplicated over here in the outliner. So let's select all of these and duplicate this column. So I'm going to hold the Shift key, select all of those. Over here, press Option D, which is duplicate linked. Sort of move those up. In fact, I'm going to come over here into the top view and move those like that. Okay, and then what we're going to do, in fact, these original ones up here, I think I'm going to move those inward just a little bit. And since those are selected, I'm going to press Option D, and I'm going to duplicate those. And I want to change their position. Maybe these will be a little bit higher up. They're all pretty regularly spaced. You know, it's probably not a big deal except for the fact that they're going to be dropping into screen in this pretty regularly spaced way. So let's come in here and apply that randomness. So I'm going to select all of these. And in fact, you can see one of them's just inside. So I'm going to move these up a little bit more. We're going to invoke the transform randomize transform function. Okay, so let's just do a rotation. Let's play with our rotation. You can just randomly put values in here, and then let's just play with, you can see how you can change that. Now this is where you want to be a little bit careful. So I'm going to come in and just change these at small amounts because you don't want to end up having any of these intersecting with each other. So we're just going to do this in rather small increments. And I like that. You know, we could play with these more, but that's good. What I'm looking for now is any interaction where they're overlapping. I don't want any of them overlapping because they'll jump out of the screen and they'll do weird things. So I think that's about done. Let's go ahead and test it. Now, as soon as you start getting more and more particles and more complexity, pressing the space bar to simulate is going to get slower and slower. So we'll do it for the first one here. So you can see those drop in and they drop in really fast. And let's pull way back out. Let's come back over here. We can see that some of them drop through again. And that is because, once again, we need to come back over here to our scene properties and we need to set this to a higher value. Now, setting that to a higher value is going to make it more accurate, and that's also going to cause it to slow down a little bit more. And this is where you're going to need to start doing pre-calculations of the cache. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to delete the current bake, and we're going to do a bake all dynamics function. But since they're falling pretty quickly, I'm only going to go to about 100 frames right here. We're going to bake all the dynamics. You can see that starting to bake. It's working a little bit harder now because we upped those iteration values. But this is going to be for actual animation purposes. Okay, there we go. And now we can see those drop in. Okay, so that's pretty cool. But this is where we want to maybe make that a little bit slower. And there are 3 ways that we can slow down an animation like this to artistically direct it. And we're going to look at those next. So one of the ways to slow them down is to change gravity. So if we come down here back to the scene properties and in the rigid body world area, we have a field weights function. And the gravity, the top one, let's change that to 0.1. Delete all bakes. And then we're going to bake all the dynamics again. Okay, there we go. Press the space bar. And you see how that sort of slowed it down. But I'd still like it to be a little bit slower. So that's one way that you can slow it down. You could even go to smaller values than that. Let's set this back up to 1. Let's delete all of the bakes right there. And let's come up and notice that there's also a speed here. So let's take this and put it at a value of 1, but it's going to slow it down. So let's give this a little bit more frames to work with. I'm going to go up to 150 for the cache. Now we're going to do a bake all dynamics. Press the space bar, and you see how that's slowing it down? You'll need to experiment with the number of frames because it didn't quite finish settling because we didn't have quite enough frames. So the next way that we're going to do it, I'm going to set this back up to the default speed of 1, is to change the frame rate for the whole animation. So let's come back here. In fact, I'm going to take, because we're sort of moving out into the frames here, I'm going to compress this. I'm just holding Control and Option so that I can see a little bit more of our total frame range right here. So let's set our current time marker back to 0. And what we want to do is let's come back here and delete all bakes. And we want to come up and do something interesting. We're going to come back to the second icon here, Output Properties. And you're going to note that our current frame rate is 30 frames a second. That's what we're targeting. When you bake a simulation, it looks at the frame rate and it bakes it relative to that frame rate. If you're going to be shooting with a real camera at a high frame rate, you can go back in and slow that down because you've got so many frames that you've recorded per second. And so we can do the same thing, principally speaking, here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to change it to 240 frames a second. So when we come back down here to the scene settings and then rigid body world, and we have it bake all dynamics, we need to go out a little bit further now. I'm going to go up to 250 frames for the total bake. We're going to do a bake all dynamics, and it's going to begin calculating now out to 250 frames. But it's doing it at 240 frames a second resolution, if you want to think about it that way. So we're dealing with a much finer data set that we can work with in exactly the same way that we could do if we shot with the camera at, say, 120 frames a second. You would take it into something like Final Cut Pro, and you could change the scale of that to slow the footage down. So what we need to do now is we need to come back up here to our output properties. We need to change back to 30, which is our actual target. Okay, so what it's now done is it's taken all that data and rescaled it back to a 30 frames per second, and that will slow us down. So now we can press the space bar, we can see that slow down. So that's another way of doing it. And the great thing is you can mix and match these techniques together. So for instance, if I come over here and I really want this to be even slower, let's come back to our starting point of 0. We could do 240. Okay, so we'll come back down here to our scene rigid body world, and I want the speed to be 0.5. Okay, this is where we would do a delete all bakes. Now let me show you something else that might happen. You might see this happen where you've done all those things and you go to bake all dynamics and it will only move 1 or 2 frames and then stop. If you see that happen, just come down here to the field weights, make a change, and then go back to the default, and for some reason that bypasses the bug. So now we come back here, bake all dynamics. So now we press the space bar, and it's now I played it at 240 frames a second, which makes the animation really smooth, but that's not what we want. And we want to again make sure to correctly reset our playback rate to the 30 frames a second we're targeting, and it will renormalize that bake data from 240 and re-spread it out to 30 frames a second, and you'll get this really nice slow sort of bake that's more sort of got this cinematic appearance to it. Okay,